Whether you're just getting started with urban sketching or you love drawing and painting little shop facades and building facades, or you're simply looking for a step-by-step comprehensive tutorial to help you practice both your drawing and your painting skills, this one is for you. In this line and wash tutorial, I take you through my entire process for this lovely coffee facade piece. I've included everything, and this is real time. No parts of the process have been cut out, from how I create my preliminary pencil sketch to my favorite pen and ink techniques that I use to define edges and add texture and detail, to how I bring in watercolor to bring the piece to life. If you'd like my outline drawing so that you can skip over the freehand sketching process and jump straight into the pen and ink and then the watercolor, it's available over on my Patreon through the link that I'm going to be leaving in the description box below. With all that said, let's jump in. So let's go ahead and get started with phase one of this process, which is the graphite sketch. There are a few key things that I have in mind whenever I am creating a preliminary sketch freehand like this. The first one is to make sure that I am drawing very lightly, that I'm not exerting pressure on my paper, because remember, drawing and sketching is a refinement process. You want to be able to erase your mistakes and refine as you go. Number two, you want to make sure that you visualize everything that you're looking at as simple shapes or forms or combinations of simple shapes or forms. Simplify everything as much as possible. And finally, make sure that you're working from largest general shapes or forms towards smaller shapes or forms and details as you go. Start always with largest general shapes or forms. Do not worry about smaller shapes and details until after those largest shapes or forms have been properly placed within your drawing area, until after you've achieved effective proportions, effective perspectives, and you've utilized your drawing space as effectively as possible. Train yourself to tune out the things that don't matter in the beginning. So the very first thing that I like doing, especially when I'm working on elevation sketches, is I like laying down horizontal and vertical lines for myself that are going to help me visualize where this front facade is going to be drawn in. Which, by the way, I just want to mention here, if you have trouble drawing long, straight lines, there is no harm and no shame in using a ruler in the beginning when you're getting started with this kind of drawing. Just make sure that you're not pressing down too hard on your paper when you are tracing that line with your ruler and your pencil. So in this photo, I noticed that it's very important to leave a good amount of space at the bottom so that I can have space to draw that sidewalk and the different important elements that are on that sidewalk, like the little table, the stool, the pots, and the little signs, etc. And so that is why I lay down that horizontal at the bottom there with a good amount of space away from that masking tape, from the edge of the masking tape. Same thing at the top. I visualized where the top edge of that building facade is at, and that's why I created my horizontal line right there, which is way closer to the edge of that masking tape at the top, because I didn't need as much space at the top there. And then after laying down the horizontals, I started placing the verticals. So essentially, I am visualizing the front plane of that shop, right? That is the rectangle that I am laying down initially with those horizontals and those verticals. Try to tune out that little awning, the things in front of the shop, anything that might be covering up those straight horizontals and verticals. You want to tune that out. I will say that the more you learn about 3D form and perspective, the more easily you're going to be able to make up for the information that you're lacking, because certain elements are covering certain edges of those shapes and forms. And this is what happens in real life. You know, you're trying to draw a house or a building, and certain parts are going to be covered up by cars, by plants, by stairs, all sorts of different things. And so it's super important that you develop your understanding of 3D form and perspective so that you're easily able to make up for the information that you're lacking. For the time being, just do your best to replicate those angles that you see in your reference photo. For the verticals, as you can see, initially I laid down the 2 verticals that would help me close that rectangle for that front plane of this shop. But then I made sure to leave extra space on the left side because I needed to make sure to include that left plane that is showing, the one that I was talking about before, that would have a slight perspective to it because it's a side plane of this 3D structure of this building. And so that's why I made sure that that vertical for that front plane was farther away from the masking tape on the left. I needed more space on the left to add in that side plane. Okay, so once I laid down the 2 initial verticals to close that front plane, I then created those slanted lines for the side plane, taking into account the angles that I saw in that reference photo as much as possible. And I closed that side plane with a 3rd vertical line that is closer to the masking tape. When it comes to slanted lines and lines at different angles, just do your best to observe that reference photo and do your best to replicate it in your drawing. Now, just a minute ago, you saw me erase those elongated horizontal lines that I had initially laid down, that I used to create those lines that are at a slight angle for that left plane that is receding away from us. Oftentimes, I lay down either horizontals or verticals longer than I actually will require them to be, and I shorten them later. Because I know that by having straight verticals or straight horizontals there for me, I'm going to more easily be able to recreate those slanted angled lines that I see in my reference photo because I have a point of reference. I have a line that I know is straight there. And our brains understand straight vertical lines and straight horizontal lines a lot more easily than lines that are at different angles. Okay, so whenever you feel that laying down a straight horizontal or vertical might be helpful for you to replicate a line that is at an angle, go ahead and do that. Another thing that can really help you is to constantly guide yourself with the lines that are already straight in your drawing and also with the edges of your masking tape and even the edges of your watercolor sheet where you can still see them. Help yourself by acknowledging those straight lines around your drawing, and they can guide you in laying down your lines in a straighter way if you're doing it freehand like I am, or also use them as guide again for those slanted lines. So after having created all of those largest, most general shapes, I am now getting started with the medium shapes. So now that those largest general shapes have been properly placed in my drawing area, this beautiful coffee shop that I'm going to be drawing is not too large that part of it is going to be cropped out of my drawing space, and it's not too small that I have a bunch of negative space around the shop. The size of it is just right. My drawing space has been utilized effectively. I have enough space below and next to these largest shapes for elements that I want to add in later. And the overall proportions look pretty effective to me. The width and height of this shop front look pretty good to me when compared to what I'm seeing in the photo. Now I can go ahead and break down these larger shapes into medium-sized areas, okay? And that is what I am working on right here. So I basically ask myself, what are the next largest shapes or areas that I have to make sure to separate out or add into these larger shapes or areas, okay? So I added in the shape where I'm going to be adding in the door, I've added in the shape for the front window, and I even started creating those slanted lines for the awning. And right here, I'm starting to add in this machine that has been mounted or installed on the side plane of this coffee shop. So as I mentioned before, this is a tall, long rectangular prism, and we're actually able to see two planes of it. So once again, I started by laying down the vertical lines, as you can see. I visualize the edges of that machine. Where is that machine in relation to that wall, okay? Place those vertical lines so that you can separate out the two planes that you're able to see of that rectangular prism. And then you're gonna start adding in the bottom horizontal and the bottom slanted line. I made sure that the slanted line that I laid down for the front edge of that machine was parallel to the slanted line that I had already laid down for the bottom edge of that side plane of the coffee shop wall. Right here, I am making out the height of this machine. I'm trying to take clues from that reference photo. If the height is not exactly the same, that's okay. I'm taking into account the bottom edge of that awning and just making sure that it is a little bit below that. So for the top of the machine, it's actually slanted. It's like a triangular prism on top of that rectangular prism. So again, I am visualizing this structure as a combo of a long rectangular prism and a triangular prism on top. Okay, so all I did there after I finished up with that rectangular prism was I created the two slanted lines, just taking into account those slants that I'm able to see in the reference photo for the top of that machine. I made sure that the two slanted lines were parallel to each other, and then I just closed that triangular prism. Right there at the bottom, I just very faintly, very loosely added in the slight description of the edge of that sidewalk, and I am now getting to work on the open door. So again, the slanted door is a flat, long, rectangular prism. We're able to see two planes of that rectangular prism, and it is receding away from us. And so we're able to see a slanted line at the top and a slanted line at the bottom. So again, I just use my knowledge of perspective and 3D form and try to replicate the slanted lines that I'm able to see in that reference photo and made them happen in my drawing. And if you turn this video back just a few seconds when I started drawing that door, you'll notice that I again started by laying down the verticals to make out the width of that door. Then I added in the slanted lines and another vertical to create the division between the front plane and the side plane. So right here, you can see me move on to adding in smaller elements. I'm getting started with drawing the table in front of the coffee shop. And as you can see, I am visualizing the top of this table as a flattened, long rectangular prism. I made sure that that rectangular prism was at a height that looked believable to me when taking into account what I see in that reference and also with what I know about tables that I've seen in my day-to-day life. And then with that rectangular prism added in, I then started taking clues for the legs of that table. And I just added in 3 visible legs that I'm able to see in that reference photo. If you'd like to add in the 4th leg, you can do it. But in the reference photo, one of those legs, from this perspective that we're seeing this scene from, is being covered by the front leg. And so I didn't really add it in. But that's totally up to you. If your drawing turns out slightly different and it just makes sense for you to add it in, you can do that. That's perfectly fine. So you saw me add in just lines to visualize those legs initially, and once those lines looked good to me in terms of their length and their location, I then turned those lines into shapes. Okay? Right here, I am starting with the stool. So right there, you can see how I visualize the top of that stool as a flat cylinder right there at the top. And then once that top of that stool was added in, I then started adding in the legs. With that out of the way, I then got started with adding in the two signs right in front of this coffee shop. I wanted to make sure to add them in because they are just smaller elements that I think will add a lot of interest and personality into this pen and wash urban sketching scene here. So these are just flat shapes right here, just rectangles. And after this, I'm going to be adding in the pot for this tree. And as I said in the beginning, in the introduction, the pot of this tree is a slightly tapered cylinder. So you're going to see me get started by adding in the top oval to make out that opening at the top of this tapered cylinder there. And then I complete this tapered cylinder by adding in the slight slanted lines on either side and adding a curve at the bottom, because remember, cylinders have curves at the top and bottom, and it's important that we make sure to describe those curves if we want this to look like a believable 3D looking plant pot there. With that pot in place, I then started sketching in the tree. And I'm not going to be sketching in the leaves because the leaves are going to be developed via mark making techniques, very loosely, very irregularly, via pen and ink first and then via color. And right here, I am continuing with my smallest shapes. So details in the door, you can see how I really paid attention to the slanted lines that I had already laid down when I was adding in the window in the door and also the designs in the bottom part of the door. You have to make sure that you're taking into account the slanted lines that you've already created so that that perspective work looks believable. And I am now adding in details very loosely in the inside of that window, little elements that we're able to see through the window. A lot of this I just brought in from imagination. I can see faintly through the window in that reference photo. I can faintly make out a counter and a window across from us and a couple of light fixtures, but I'm not really trying to, get them super close to what I am seeing there because these are like really secondary or even tertiary elements that I am adding in, and you can feel free to bring in your imagination, especially when you're adding in smaller details like these. I do really like the idea of adding in these little lights. This seems like it's around Christmas time. I don't necessarily want this sketch to look very Christmassy, so I'm not going to be adding in the little decorative cutouts at the bottom of that window there that I see, which in that reference photo, you can see those little cutouts, Christmas tree cutouts along the bottom of that window. I'm not going to be adding that in because I don't want to make this a Christmassy scene. But I do really like those hanging Christmas tree style lights. But I know a lot of people use them outside of the Christmas season, so I don't think that's going to make it look too Christmassy necessarily. I really like that detail and I'm going to add it in. So those curved intersecting lines that I added into that window, that's where I'm going to be adding in those little lights. And right here, I'm adding some elements that we're able to see through this open doorway. So I added in a little bench, and you can see how I visualize that little bench as another flat rectangular prism with another rectangular prism on the right of it for those legs. And I also added in a bit of an illusion of a frame, a picture frame or an art frame, something like that hanging on the wall. Moving on to some final refinements right here on this machine. I'm going to be adding in a little line here for the sidewalk, slanted little line that I'm able to see in the reference photo there. And I am now moving on to adding in the letters for the name of this coffee shop right here. When I'm going to be adding in any type of sign or lettering into this kind of piece, I always draw those letters with my pencil first in this pencil part of the process, because pen and ink is permanent. We're not going to be able to erase whatever we do with our pen. And so especially for the most important words. So for example, this is the name of this coffee shop. I wanted to make sure that the letters were in a good size and also that they were kind of centered in that space and that shape of that awning. And so that is why I always make sure to just draw in those letters with pencil first. That way I can erase them and do any correcting that has to be done before actually drawing them in with pen and ink. All right, so right here you're seeing me add in those stripes in the design of this awning, the black and white stripes. I started with a near vertical line right in the middle of this awning shape. And then I started slanting them more and more as I moved those lines out towards either side. Whatever slanted diagonal line angle you've created for the edge of that shape at the top of the awning, you want that last line that you draw for that stripe to be almost parallel to that. So your line should be going from straight and near vertical in the center, and they should gradually become more and more slanted until you reach either side of the shape of the awning, right? And the last line that you lay down has to be nearly parallel to that outer edge. Moving on to phase number 2 of this process, which is the pen and ink phase. Before bringing out my pen, I am going to gently tap my kneaded eraser over my sketch a bit to clean it up, to remove any excess graphite that might be floating around that I really don't want to start smearing on my watercolor sheet, and maybe even lighten my sketch a tiny bit more. All right, so once I'm ready, I'm going to go ahead and bring out my Staedtler pigment liner. This is a 0.1 tip. All right, so I am going to get started with defining the edges of the shapes that I've already laid down with my pencil. In other words, we're going to be tracing over the line work that we've already created with graphite. I would recommend, if you can, to go through the process the same way you did with your graphite work. So try tracing over the larger shapes first and making your way towards smaller shapes and details if you can. Another tip, and I don't always follow this, but here's a tip, you might find it helpful. If you are right-handed, try working from left to right. And if you're left-handed, try working from right to left. Something that's also key to have in mind is that because we're working with a permanent medium and we're not going to be able to erase this, every single line or mark that you lay down is going to remain visible, right? And so you have to be careful not to trace over segments of lines or shapes that would actually be covered up by another element that is in front of it. So just as an example of what I am saying, as you can see, that sign that is right in front of the tree on the left, the one that is right next to the machine, that sign is covering up part of that tree, and it's also covering up part of the bottom edge of that machine to the left of it. And so this is why I made sure to stop that line of the edge of the machine right there when I reached that little rectangle for that sign. I made sure not to continue working that line all the way down if it was actually going to be covered up by that sign. So remember to stop those lines whenever you need to. Now, all this said, as I've mentioned in past pen and ink tutorials, which I highly, highly recommend checking those out if you're interested in improving your pen and ink sketching skills, I'm going to make sure to leave them down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check them out. But it is important to keep moving, right? I'm not saying you have to draw super, super fast. I know that it is difficult to move fast when you're just getting started and are not yet very confident with the medium on hand. It can be intimidating, especially because of its permanence, but it is important to keep it moving, to keep your hand and your wrist moving and flowing, because if you work way too slow, you hesitate, right? You stop in the middle of the line or the mark, you're probably going to start getting stop and start marks, little dots where that ink starts coming down the tip of your pen. and you get these little dots, right? And you don't want that. In order to avoid that, you have to go in with a certain level of confidence, which of course comes with practice, and you have to keep it moving, keep it flowing. It's actually preferable to have slight wobbles and imperfections in your pen and ink work than to have very, very rigid, very straight and perfect lines. And this goes back to the line weight variation topic that I've been bringing up time and time again in my pen and ink tutorials that I've shared in the past. And one of the ways to develop line weight variation in your lines is to move fast, to keep it flowing. You've probably also noticed that I am many times approaching this tracing in segments. There are little sections in which my lines are not really connecting. And this also helps me stay away from the look of flatness and cartoony type outlines. So essentially, just as a refresher, line weight variation refers to having a variation in weight throughout our lines and marks. So when it comes to lines and marks, we develop different visual weights by making certain sections of that line or that mark thicker or darker, and other sections of those lines and marks thinner and lighter. Certain sections are lighter visually and other sections are heavier visually. So if we have lines and marks that have that line weight variation throughout them, as opposed to having one consistent thickness from start to end, they are going to lead to more dynamic, interesting results. Bring to mind, for example, a coloring book outline page. Those coloring book pages usually have one same line weight all throughout. That line is usually black, it's very thick, and the weight of those lines, of those outlines, are consistent all throughout that coloring book page. It leads to a lot of flatness, and that's not usually what we're looking for with this kind of pen and ink work. For the leaves of the trees, I am using a loose scribbling technique. I really enjoy bringing in scribbling when I'm going to be sketching in organic elements like leaves and plants. For the scribbling technique, I'm really just letting go and letting my hand and my wrist just do what they want, moving my hand from side to side and also doing little loops and shapes, very irregular shapes. Not really trying to do any specific pattern or draw any perfect shape or anything like that. I definitely want to bring in a lot of irregularity because otherwise it's not really going to look like a natural element or subject here. It's super important to have everything just be very irregular looking. It can be easy to overdo it with the scribbling, so I make sure to take breaks, take a step back, see everything as a whole, and if I feel I've done enough to describe those leaves, I leave it be. Alright, so right here I am really just adding in the smaller shapes and details at this point. I continue having line weight variation in mind as I move through this in order to stay away from any sort of stiffness. In past pen and ink tutorials, I've shared how there are really 4 ways that you can develop a line weight variation in your pen and ink sketches. And the more you develop your skills with pen and ink, the more you start shifting and changing the way you're doing these 4 things subconsciously, and this really shows in your outcomes. So these 4 things, just as a refresher, the first one is of course what I just mentioned before in terms of moving quicker versus slower. Usually when you move quicker, that is going to lead to more dynamic, looser lines. The second one is the angle at which you're using your pen. So if you use your pen in an upright, vertical position or perpendicular to the surface of your paper, the ink is going to come down in a different way from how the ink comes down if you were using that pen at a 30-degree angle or 45-degree angle from the surface of your paper. Another thing, of course, is the pressure that you're exerting on your pen. If you press down harder as you're moving your pen, those lines and marks that you create are going to look thicker, heavier, darker than when you don't exert as much pressure on your paper. Those lines and marks are going to look lighter and thinner. And finally, of course, there's the pen tip size in and of itself. So you can choose to actually bring in 2 different sizes of pen tips or 3 different pen tip sizes into your drawing and shift and change them in your drawing process as needed to make some lines and marks thicker and heavier than others. However, if you're able to change the way that you're doing the first 3, you can get away with just using one same pen tip size and really create a nice line weight variation and add a lot of a dynamic look, an interesting look into your lines and marks using just one tip size. I did my best to trace over the elements that we are able to see through the window in a looser and even thinner way, at least in some sections, so that I could make those elements look even lighter in visual weight than the elements that are actually closer to us outside of this coffee shop. And I did this by drawing those lines even more quickly and shifting the angle at which I was using that pen so that the ink didn't flow down that pen tip as quickly. So instead of using a, say, 45-degree angle from my paper, I was using a 25-30-degree angle from my paper. All right, so I am getting started with the letters and the little details in the signs with my pen and ink here. In terms of the lettering, I just wanted to make sure to add in what was most important. So of course the name of the coffee shop at the top there was super huge, and I made sure to use those letters that I had initially laid down for myself with graphite, but you probably noticed that I wasn't too precise with those letters that I had drawn in with pencil. I just used them as a loose guide. And you can see me add in some letters here into these signs, the menu on the right of the coffee shop, and also this takeaway sign right here in front of this little tree. For the menu, I use the scribbling technique again for those smaller letters. But this takeaway sign right here, I actually wanted to write the words down on. I thought it would be fun and just it would add some personality into the piece. All right, so when I am done here, I am going to allow all of this to dry completely. These Staedtler pigment liners, they dry pretty fast, but I would recommend making sure that everything is completely dry before doing what I am going to be doing next, which is erasing all of the graphite work. So when I am done with this piece, I don't want to see any of the pencil work that I initially laid down for myself. So that's what I'm doing right here. I'm erasing everything with my soft graphite eraser. And just again, it's super important that you allow all of that pen and ink to dry completely before going in with any sort of eraser, because I don't want you to smudge your amazing work. Be careful with that. And you probably saw me sweep off, dust off those eraser bits with my absorbent towel that is completely dry by this point. Instead of using my hand to wipe or swipe that off, it's very important that you realize that you can leave oils or even like lotion. If you have applied lotion on your hands, you can leave that on your watercolor paper, and then the paint that you're going to be laying down later with your watercolor washes, it doesn't set and absorb the same way, and you could be left with white kind of blotchiness if those oils from your hand get placed on your paper. So that is why you saw me sweep those eraser bits with my absorbent towel instead of using my hand. All right, doing the last little details here in this pen and ink phase, what you're seeing me do right here is hatching. So this is an alternative shading technique. Hatching, cross-hatching, contour lines, cross-contour lines. There is a variety of alternative shading techniques that we can use to develop different values in a pen and ink sketch, as well as different textures. And all hatching is laying down groups of straight parallel lines. There has to be a consistency in those lines in terms of the angle that that slant is going down at, that diagonal, and also the amount of space left between your lines also has to be relatively similar. Okay, so there has to be a consistency within those groups of lines that you lay down with hatching. The slant, it doesn't have to be going off in any particular direction, but there has to be a consistency within that direction that you pick, that angle that you pick. So because this is going to be a mixed media piece, we're going to be developing a certain amount of values, and we're going to be bringing in color with our watercolor. I am not going to worry so much about describing different values and just doing a lot of alternative shading and mark making techniques. It's important that when you are going to be combining different mediums, that you think of how you're going to be balancing those mediums out. You don't want to overly describe with either, because at the end you can be left with a piece that looks too heavy, too overworked, too overdone. And I want to just make sure that I balance the work that I am doing with the two mediums that I am bringing in out. So all I am doing with this hatching work right here is I am creating a faint illusion of shadow effects in places where it would make sense that cast shadows or darker values would be created or would be seen. So the section under the awning, it would make sense that there is some shadow there. In this plane opposite to the light source in this machine, and under the table, and the section that we're able to see through the window and through the doorway. There seems to be a dim lighting situation in the coffee shop. That is why I added the hatching in those places. But again, I wanted to make sure not to overdo it because I would be developing some values alongside my color with my watercolor. All right, and finally, let's move on to phase number 3, which is going to be the watercolor washes. So first and foremost, I want to swatch out these 6 different colors that I am going to be using for you right here on this scrap piece of watercolor paper so that you can actually see what these colors look like, just in case you don't have these exact colors that I am going to be using. You can just replace them with any color that is similar, or a color mixture using the colors that you have that lead to a similar color. All of the colors that I chose here are based on the reference photo. I wasn't really that interested in getting colors exactly the same as the hues that I see in that reference photo, but I did choose colors that to me looked quite similar. That top green, that deep, dark, rich green is called Perylene Green. It's from Daniel Smith. All of these are from Daniel Smith. If you don't have a green that is similar to this one, you could certainly feel free to add in something like an indigo, which is a very deep, dark blue, into one of your greens to see if you get a similar green, or maybe even try adding in a bit of neutral tint into one of your greens to get a deep, dark, kind of bluish biased green for the front of that coffee shop. The second green that I swatched out right there for you is the sap green. The yellow is Hansa Yellow Light, which I'm going to be using for light effects and also to create a variety of different greens for the leaves of the trees. And then this lighter brown that I swatched out is Raw Sienna. The brown at the bottom is Burnt Umber, and then this gray at the top is Neutral Tint. If you've checked out any of my past watercolor painting tutorials or watercolor pencil tutorials, you probably already know that I'm a huge fan of planning, pre-selecting the colors that I'm going to be using for the piece on hand before getting started. And so for me, it's just very important to know exactly the colors that I'm going to be using. It's very easy to start accidentally dipping your paintbrush into a green that you weren't intending to use, a brown that you weren't intending to use, that look quite similar to that color that you were using before, and then all of a sudden you bring in a color that you weren't intending to use. And so this is my way of avoiding accidents, staying away from color mixtures, muddy colors that I really didn't want to create, and that kind of thing. Also by making sure that I have pre-selected my color palette and oftentimes limiting the amount of colors that I'm going to be using, I know that at the end my piece is going to look a lot more harmonious and integrated because I'm not randomly bringing in colors throughout the painting process. Alright, so what I am doing right here is preparing my color mixtures that I'm going to be using for this painting, for my watercolor washes. So it is absolutely essential that the color mixtures that you create for yourself are nice and juicy. You want them to have a good amount of color in them, but you also want a good amount of water in them as well. So I would say something like 50% color, 50% water in your color mixtures is what you want, because essentially we want to be able to load up our paintbrush bristles with a good amount of paint in them and go in loose and relatively quick. And if your color mixtures are dry, meaning they have little to no water in them, you're not going to be able to load up your paintbrush bristles effectively and go in with a good amount of paint and paint a section quickly, lay down that wash quickly and easily. You're going to have to go back and reload and then come back into your piece and go back to reload and come back into your piece, and you don't want to do that. With quick washes like with this piece that we're going to be working on, you want to be able to go in fast and you want to be able to cover up sections of that paper relatively quickly with one same paintbrush load, so to speak. Okay, so right there at the top, I prepared some of my Hansa yellow light with a bit of water in it. Below it, I created two different greens for myself. The green in the circular paint well there is plain sap green with a bit of water in it. And on the right of that green, I have a sap green plus Hansa yellow light. Those two greens are for my tree leaves. And really those are the only colors that we're going to be mixing together for this piece, because all of the other colors is just the plain color with some water in it. Right here below the greens, I am preparing some Pearland green for the walls of that coffee shop with a bit of water in it. Again, I'm making sure that my color mixtures are nice and juicy. I want a good amount of water movement in them. And below my Pearland green, I am preparing my two browns, some raw sienna with a bit of water in it. And then on the right of that, I'm going to prepare some burnt umber with some water in it. And then right below that, I'm going to be preparing some of my neutral tint with a bit of water in it. So this paint is by no means all of the paint that I'm going to be requiring for my watercolor washes. I'm going to be making more of these colors along the way when I run out. When I feel that they've become way too watery, I'm going to add more color into them. Or when I feel that maybe the color has dried out on my palette, I'm going to add more water into it. So it's a very fluid process painting with watercolor, but now I am aware of the different colors that I'm going to be using for each area of my painting, and I know exactly what color I have to make more of for whatever section it is that I have to paint. Alright, so after preparing my different color mixtures, I changed my water because my water was looking pretty murky, and I wanted to make sure that I was starting out with a fresh container of water. And we're ready to go. So I am going to get started with my size 16 round brush from Princeton. I am going to prepare the paintbrush bristles of this paintbrush by swiveling my paintbrush in my container of water, dampening those bristles, removing the excess water by gently scraping those bristles alongside the top of my container there, and loading up this paintbrush as best as I can with my raw sienna. I loosely paint in a shape with this raw sienna along the edge of this coffee shop to kind of add a little bit of color and describe the color for the shop or restaurant or whatever it is that is on the right of our main coffee shop that we're painting today. And as soon as I feel I have placed enough color on my paper, I remove the raw sienna from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in while that paint is still wet and I soften the edges of that very abstract, irregular shape that I painted in. So you can see me go in and do some kind of pulling out of that color that I lay down, and that creates a nice soft gradient in which that raw sienna transitions into the white of the paper. Okay, and right here I allowed myself to drop in a bit of that raw sienna once again along the edge of my coffee shop. I always make sure to drop in the color along the edge of my coffee shop because I want the color to dissipate into the whiteness of the paper as it's moving away from the focal point of this picture, which is our coffee shop. So you want to make sure that you always start by placing the color right along the focal point so that you can dissipate that color out from there, pull it out from there. I also painted that top bit, the side plane of this restaurant or whatever it is on the right, on the top of the coffee shop. I made sure to go in with my raw sienna in a pretty translucent state for that side plane that is catching the light there. After finishing up with the raw sienna, I rinsed out my size 16 round brush, set it aside, and I switched on over to using my size 6 round brush. I dampened these paintbrush bristles, prepared my paintbrush, loaded it up with my light green that I created by mixing together my sap green and my Hansa yellow light, and I started painting in the leaves of this tree. I always start with a lighter color and I drop in the darker color after I have created my lighter value areas. This technique that I am using right here to paint in the leaves of the tree is also referred to as scribbling, and it is a technique that I explain in a past video that I shared on the main brush strokes to know about and to practice, which I'm going to make sure to leave a link to down below in the text section of this post. Scribbling is a super useful technique when it comes to painting trees and organic elements in watercolor pieces. Essentially, you're going in sometimes with just the tip of your paintbrush, other times you're pressing down a little bit more, but you're really letting loose and allowing your hand, your wrist, and your paintbrush to do their thing. Sometimes you're moving your paintbrush up and down, so lifting your paintbrush up from your page and then pressing down, but also in a lateral way, towards the left, towards the right, creating light scribbles and very different, irregular, abstract, organic shapes. All of this as you're dropping in your greens and developing different green values throughout the leaves of the tree. Right there, you saw me do a tiny bit of lifting of that very dark green paint that I had laid down in the upper left section of this tree on the left. I just went in with my clean and slightly damp paintbrush and did a little bit of lifting of that excess green paint. I thought that section was looking a little bit too stark looking and flat. So remember that you can always go in to do some lifting with either a little section of your absorbent towel or the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush. As long as your paint is still wet, you can always go in and do some lifting. So remember that the point with the leaves of the tree, the objective with those leaves is to develop a range of different green values and hues so that we can really give dimension to those leaves and create a sensation of light and shadow. What's also important when you're painting plants and trees is to make sure that you're leaving little windows, little sections in which you're able to see through and into the background behind the tree, because in real life this happens. We're able to see the sky behind the tree, the mountains behind the tree, the walls behind the tree, whatever is behind the trees. We're able to see a bit of them through the groupings of different leaves. So make sure that you leave little sections of paper unpainted, abstract little shapes of paper just unpainted in between your leaves. Otherwise, the leaves of your tree are likely going to look pretty flat and not very believable. All right, so after painting in the leaves of the trees, it was time for me to get started with painting in the green wall or the front wall of this coffee shop. So this is me going in once again with my size 6 round brush and my Parylene green this time. So I rinsed out all of the previous green from my paintbrush bristles before loading up my paintbrush with a good amount of this Perlin green, with this juicy Perlin green color mixture. I am doing my best to work as quickly as possible, but being careful about working around the leaves of the tree that I just painted in, as well as all of these different elements that I've added into my drawing in the section of the picture, which, by the way, the leaves of my trees are already pretty dry. I was working in a pretty warm, dry environment, and so everything is drying pretty fast for me, especially because I am working on paper that is dry. And when we paint on dry paper, when we don't pre-wet it with clean water like other techniques that I've shown in other tutorials, our paint starts drying immediately when it's placed on paper. And this means that if we don't load up our paintbrush bristles with a good amount of paint and work relatively quickly, picking up that edge or that bead where you just left off in that shape that you just painted in, to pull out that color and continue painting, most likely than not, you're going to be left with a sharp, defined edge around those edges of the shapes that you're painting because that paint is starting to dry, okay? And so you want to make sure that, again, you create a nice juicy color mixture for yourself so that you don't have to reload as often, so that you can cover up the largest shape you possibly can, the largest area you possibly can, and then load up your paintbrush and come back to the edge where you just left off to pick up from there. Essentially, you don't want that last section of the last shape that you painted in to dry before going back in and picking that edge right up. And I mean, I was left with little edges here and there myself. Sometimes I was able to soften that edge by just going back over that little section with a little bit more of my paint in a semi-translucent state. And other times I just embraced the fact that a little texture happened in that area and I left it be, I left it alone. And this is something that I think is very important to learn or train yourself to do, especially when painting with watercolor. Train yourself to embrace the organic irregularity, the organic little imperfections that happen when you're painting with watercolor. Because otherwise what's going to happen is that you're going to find the need to go back in and fix all of those little textures, those little imperfections that happen, and then you're going to be left with an overworked piece. And it's preferable to have little textures and little effects happen than to have an overworked, flat-looking piece. This is the beauty of watercolor. We can only control it to a certain extent. We can only control what happens to a certain extent, right? We can do our planning of strategies, we can learn about water control, and all of these skills and knowledge that we can develop, but at the same time, there are so many different variables that come into play when we're painting with watercolor. Everything from the type of paper that we're using, the quality of our paint, the quality of our brushes, but even, the environment that we're working in. As I was mentioning before, if you're working in a warm environment, if you're working in a cold environment, if it is a humid environment, if you have a fan or the air conditioning or a heating system on, all of that is going to make your paint dry faster or slower, and that is going to affect both your painting process as well as your final outcome. And the more quickly we embrace these things, getting great at water control and all these things that we can control, but also embracing the little accidents and the little imperfections that happen along the way, the better off we'll be. Essentially, the less amount of moving around of paint that you do after it's been placed on paper, the better your painting, the fresher the outcome is going to be. All right, so I finished up with my Perlin green walls, and what I am working on right now are the black stripes on the coffee shop awning. This is my neutral tint with some water in it, and I am going in with, this is still my size 6 round brush. I just cleaned out all of the previous Perlin green color from those bristles before going into my neutral tint. And hopefully you can see how I am really trying to develop a variety of values even within these black stripes. So because I made sure to go in with a juicy mixture that had some water in it, I am able to use this color in more of a translucent state in certain sections and then drop in a little bit more color while that paint is still wet to deepen and darken certain sections within that larger shape. And this allows me to create more dimension in these shapes. Instead of going in with a super dry, super saturated color mixture right off the bat that looks super, super black, saturated black, that would lead to a lot of flatness. I want to make sure that there is a variety of grays, that certain sections look very light and translucent, that other sections look a little bit darker and more saturated, and then that I have even darker sections of darkest darks. And hopefully you can also see how I've embraced just leaving little teeny tiny sections of white paper shining through that are left completely unpainted. And I love doing this throughout my painting process. They happen organically, naturally, as I am moving my paintbrush around. And I just leave them be because this helps me create the illusion of little highlights, of light effects. Right here, I am doing some lifting once again with my clean and only slightly damp paintbrush. I am using my paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge to pick up some of that excess pigment and add more dimension back into these shapes that I feel were starting to look a little bit too heavy, a little bit too flat. I would much rather go in with my neutral tint in a semi-translucent watered down state and then deepen and darken certain sections within that instead of going in with a super dark saturated color mixture right off the bat, because you're gonna have a very, very dark value all throughout that. And you need lighter value areas, areas that are more translucent, in order for different elements to have dimension to them, to have an illusion of light and shadow. All right, so just finishing up here with these stripes, I'm pretty happy with how they're looking. I'm gonna take a quick second to paint in this strip, long horizontal section with my Perlin green, which I hadn't painted in before. Now, I am painting this in right now. Again, my black sections are completely dry by this point because I'm painting on dry paper and I'm working in the warm, dry environment that I am working in. So if I had painted in that section of Perlin green while the black shapes were still wet, I would risk the black merging and bleeding into this new green section that I just painted in, but the black was pretty dry by that point. Now, there is no problem when that happens. Some artists love having colors bleed into each other, so it's just a matter of preference. If you don't want colors to start merging and bleeding into each other, just make sure that you're allowing that previous section that you painted in to dry completely before continuing with your painting process in a shape that is right next to that. All right, so what I'm working on right here is this asphalt or the sidewalk right in front of the coffee shop. For this, because it's a pretty large shape, I decided to switch on back to my size 16 round brush. You can see how this neutral tint has a good amount of water in it. It doesn't look too saturated or super, super dark or black. And a key thing there is, once again, I got started by placing my color right along the bottom edge of the coffee shop. I made my way down from there as I painted in that initial shape, and once I felt I had a good amount of color on my paper, I removed the gray from my paintbrush bristles. I went back in with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush, and I pulled that color down. So I pulled and expanded that color that was already on my paper and covered up a larger portion of my page with it, which weakened that color even more, and at the same time helped me create a gradual transition from a darker gray along the bottom of the coffee shop there, and then it weakened and weakened and became lighter and lighter as I pulled that gray away from that coffee shop. You can see how I left a very abstract organic shape for that gray. I by no means try to create a perfect blocky shape, trying to perfectly draw the sidewalk edge or anything like that. I embrace that irregular, imperfect shape created by my paintbrush bristles. And while that initial light gray layer was still wet, I dropped in a little bit more of my neutral tint in a more saturated state in little sections of cast shadow that I wanted to deepen and darken more. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, so using this same paintbrush, my size 6 round brush, and my neutral tint, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with painting in the window. So again, it's this idea of going in initially with a light, translucent version of your color, right? So in this case, I'm using neutral tint. I'm making sure that initially this layer that I'm painting in is nice and translucent, it's watered down. You can use your scrap piece of watercolor paper to test out your color mixture and ensure that you're going in initially with a color mixture that is pretty translucent if there is any doubt in your mind that maybe your color is too saturated or too dry, okay? So I went in with that initial translucent gray. I then dropped in a little bit more of my neutral tint in certain sections that I wanted to deepen and darken within that lighter gray shape. So you can see how I'm still able to see my little elements that I drew in with my pen and ink. Imagine if I had gone in with my neutral tint in a very saturated, dry state, I wouldn't be able to see these elements that I added in with my pen and ink. While that neutral tint layer was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of my Hansa yellow light using my smallest paintbrush that I picked out for this painting process, which is my size 2 round brush, into the little light fixtures and lights that I have hanging by the window. And because I dropped in that yellow while that gray was still wet, I had a nice diffused out soft effect to those lights, which is what I wanted. Now, if you drop in your yellow and you notice that that yellow expands out like crazy, there's a ton of movement when you drop it in, it means that your paper is very, very wet. And if it doesn't expand out at all and you're not left with any blurred out effects to those edges, it means that your paper is already pretty dry. There is no right or wrong way to do this, but just know that if you're looking to have that blurred out effect, then you're going to want to drop in that yellow when that paper is still wet. Now, when you're painting with watercolor, there are different degrees of wetness to the paper. And the more you practice painting with this medium, the better you get at just acknowledging, observing, and knowing when is the right level of wetness that you should be dropping your color in for the particular effects that you're looking for that area. So it's important just to know why this happens and to take a note of how wet your paper is, how wet or how dry, and to just know that in the future, if you want another thing to happen, then you should probably drop it in while that paint is still wet or after the paint has dried. Okay, so right here, I'm starting to paint in the visible portions of the coffee shop that we can see through the open doorway here. So I am using my size 6 round brush once again, and in the bottom there, I wanted to create that illusion of wooden floor. So I used my burnt umber to paint in the floor right there at the bottom. And then after that, I removed the burnt umber from my paintbrush bristles and I painted the wall portion with my neutral tint once again. Also, the visible portion of the wall that we're able to see through the window of the door, I also painted with neutral tint. And right here, I'm removing the neutral tint from my paintbrush bristles and I switched on back to the burnt umber to paint in the little bench. Now, all of this I am painting without waiting for the color around the shapes that I'm just painting in to dry, because I'm okay with that bleeding and merging of colors to happen, because this section inside of the doorway, it's pretty dark and I want those shapes to merge into each other because I don't want those shapes to be super defined or as defined as the elements that I'm going to be painting outside of the coffee shop, which are closer to the viewer, which I do want to paint in a sharper, more defined way. So I'm okay with those shapes merging and bleeding into each other, the ones inside of the coffee shop. Right here, just to finish up this area, I switched on back to my size 2 round brush, and I am once again dropping in a little bit of my Hansa yellow light, just to create a little bit of an illusion of light. while that paint is still wet. So I get that nice diffused out, blurred out effect to that light. All right, you guys, so we are officially in the final stretch of this painting process. All that's left is painting in the missing elements and details outside of the coffee shop, closer to us as the viewer of this scene. So I'm going to get started with painting in the little plants in this tree pot right here on the right. So I'm still using my size 2 round brush. And I am going back to the scribbling technique for these little plant sections. I used the lighter green first, the sap green plus the Hansa yellow light. And once I had that lighter green in, I dropped in a little bit of my pure sap green, the darker green, in certain sections that I wanted to deepen and darken within that larger plant section. I then removed all of the green from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm using this same smallest round brush that I selected for this painting process to paint in the tree trunks and the branches. And for this, I am using my burnt umber. The brush strokes that I use to paint in the tree trunks and the branches are quite different from the brush strokes that I've been using so far, because I like using short, kind of more linear upwards strokes to help me at least describe the texture of that wood a bit. You can see how I'm leaving little teeny tiny, elongated, narrow, kind of long sections of paper shining through, completely unpainted, as I am painting in these long linear brush strokes that help me describe a little bit of that wood texture. And to paint the branches, you want to, as much as possible, paint in the small branches with one same stroke. And the branches get thinner and thinner as they move away from the main tree trunk. So you kind of want those ends of those small branches to be tapered at the end, creating single brush strokes and lifting that brush up as you just paint in that branch helps you develop that tapered look to the end, or that narrow, very thin look at the end of those branches. Something I'm doing right here is I'm doing some light lifting because some of these sections of these branches look a little bit too stark to me. And I'm just doing a little bit of lifting by going in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush. I do a little bit of gentle scrubbing in the sections that I want to make lighter, and then I just lift up some of that color with my absorbent towel, and that should help make certain sections of those branches less stark looking, if that happens to you as well. All right, moving on to painting in the little table and other little things here in the front of the coffee shop. So I switched on back to my size 6 round brush, and I am going to be using the raw sienna and the burnt umber for a few of these things here. Initially for the table, I went in with pure raw sienna for those lighter values, lighter brown values. And then with that initial layer of light brown, my raw sienna still wet, I then dropped in a little bit of burnt umber, my darker brown, in certain sections that I wanted to darken within that. And I brought in my knowledge of light behavior and gave thought to what sections within this it would make sense for me to darken and create a little bit of a cast shadow effect in. So for example, the tops of the legs of the table would have some shadow on them because that top section of the table would be blocking the light from hitting those portions of the legs. And also in general, like I gave thought to what section of the table would be catching a little bit of the light from the sun that awning wouldn't be blocking. So I thought of leaving the section or the edge of the table closer to us, just catching a little bit more light, so with lighter values, and the rest of the table with darker brown values. Then I painted in the tree pot with the burnt umber, and you just saw me a moment ago do a little bit of lifting because I had placed way too much paint on this very small shape. So again, after placing my color, I kind of acknowledged the fact I noticed that I had placed way too much paint on there. So I removed the color from my paintbrush bristles and did a little bit of lifting of excess color with the bristles of my paintbrush. You can also go in, of course, with your absorbent towel if you prefer that over using your paintbrush bristles. After that, I painted a couple of other small elements. I painted in the little stool and a little section of the door using my lighter brown, which is the raw sienna. and then I prepared some more of my neutral tint with some water in it because I was running out. And you can see me right here using my size 6 round brush to paint in the machine that is installed on this left plane of this building. I started by painting in the plane that is closest to us, the plane on the right, and then with that same paintbrush load, so without reloading my paintbrush, I then painted in the plane on the left that is closest to the light source. It's important to remember that as you continue painting with one same paintbrush load, that color and that water start running out from your paintbrush bristles as you move on continuing to paint, right? And so when I get started with painting in the darkest areas, and then I move on to painting lighter areas that I want to achieve with that same color, this just helps me ensure that the darker areas will have the majority of that color from that paintbrush load, right? And then once I finish painting that darker area and I move on to the lighter areas, I won't have as much paint in my paintbrush bristles. So naturally, that color that I paint in the lighter sections with will appear lighter. And so this is why it's always super helpful after you've loaded up your paintbrush and you're going to be starting with a new section to ask yourself, which are the darker sections that I'm going to be creating within this larger shape, and start there. And then make your way out from there with that same paintbrush load. Okay, so I'm very loosely, very quickly painting a few other minor details with my raw sienna, and I'm going in with a very light translucent version of my neutral tint here, just to add a little bit of different gray values into sections or shapes that are completely flat white at this point. So I am going to be adding a little bit of a light gray into certain sections of the awning. So the awning design is, of course, black and white stripes. So it's a black and white design. However, in real life, we don't see flat shapes like this. And so this is why I'm going in with a very, very translucent, watered down version of my neutral tint and just very quickly doing some brush strokes in this area to create very organic, irregular shapes and develop at least somewhat of a variety of different values in these flat white areas. Make sure that you're going in with your neutral tints in a very, very watered down translucent state. Make sure that you test it out on your scrap piece of watercolor paper, because if you go in with your neutral tint in a very saturated state, you're gonna get rid of the illusion of these stripes being white. I made the decision, by the way, to leave that section where the lettering is for the name of that coffee shop white, as opposed to the black that appears in the reference photo. And this is because I drew in those letters with black ink, and the letters in the photo are white, right? I could have made the choice to paint in that section black and then go in at the end of my painting process with a white paint pen. All right, so I'm just finishing up with some minor details in the front of the coffee shop. So first I painted in the frame, wooden frame of those chalkboards with my burnt umber. And I am now darkening certain sections with my dark green, my sap green, using my size 6 round brush in some of the leaves of these trees. So the idea is just to deepen and darken certain sections because my trees are looking, or my leaves of my trees are looking a little bit too light, and they're supposed to be in the shadow created by that awning. So I just wanted to deepen and darken certain sections using my sap green. If you want to soften any of the hard edges around the dark green shapes that you're painting in, all you have to do is remove the color from your paintbrush bristles and go back in with the clean and just slightly damp paintbrush and run the tips of those bristles of your paintbrush along the edge, and that's going to soften those edges. Because we're painting on paper that is dry, those edges are going to be pretty sharp. Now, if you've already developed a nice variety of different greens with that initial layer of greens that we created for the leaves, then this new darker green that you are placing shouldn't be that stark, but you're still going to be left with sharp edges because we're painting on dry paper. And so if at any point you want to, soften those edges, all you have to do is go in with your clean and slightly damp paintbrush and run the bristles of your paintbrush over those edges. Now remember, you don't want to place way too much dark green because you definitely want to have a nice variety of green values. You don't want to overpower or cover up those lighter greens that you've already developed. Really, less is more. All right, final little thing here. I'm going to be painting the black sections of these chalkboards. So again, I made sure to go in with my neutral tint in a pretty translucent state. Remember to test out your neutral tint mixture on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in, because if you go in with this neutral tint in a very dry, saturated state, then most likely than not, you're going to cover up that lettering work, that mark making that you already did in these shapes, and it's not going to be very visible at all. So you can see how I went in with a pretty translucent version of the neutral tint to paint that in. And just to finish this up, I'm also going to be darkening certain sections of the inner part of the coffee shop that we're able to see through the window. I'm just approaching that in a very loose way, still using my neutral tint in a very, very translucent state. That helped me add a little bit more contrast to certain sections and define some edges a little bit more. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this one, that you learned something new. I wish you a beautiful rest of the day and talk to you very, very soon. Bye guys!